Alright then, this is 9-1. No sure you realize that isn't? Nope. Whoa! If you consume, Julie. I know, right? If I consume, I was gonna make sure until I realized that. If I consume, right? Yeah, yep. Okay. Until I realized that, right? Yep. Whoa, 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 okay. Until you realize that. Yep. If you consume, Julie. If I was trying to make sure, definitely. Right. Eventually. Okay. I was gonna make sure, right? Yep, it does, Vigily. Of course. You have no idea, right? Yep. If you consider Vigily. Of course. Right. Okay. So you're no sure, isn't? Nope, I checked last time, Vigily. Of course. I was gonna make sure about ours. I know, right? Yep, if you consume, Vigily. Right, of course. Do I realize that? Yep, you can't figure this out, Vigily. Of course. So if I consume, yep, you have to keep that for ours. I know, Vigily. Do you realize that? Yep, if you consume. Right. Do you realize that? I know, Vigily. If I consume. Right. So, you do not realize that? I know, Vigily. If I consume. Yep, I was gonna make sure. I know, right? Eventually. Until you realize that. Yep. Okay, I did not put that. Alright then. If you can see visually. Yep. Whoa. I'm not sure you realize that. I know, visually. If I consume. Yep. Not sure you realize that. I know, visually. If you consume. Yep. If I consume, visually. Of course. If you consume, right? Yep. If I consume. Of course.
Astrobot. Expel intruders.
You know sure you realize that, isn't? Nope, visually. Okay. Until you realize that. Yep, visually. Of course. No, sure you realize that. Yep, if you can see him, Julie. Of course. If you can see him, Julie. I know. So if you can see him. Yep. This is 9-1. Not sure you realize that? Yep. Hey, if you can see him visually. Okay. I was gonna make sure, right? Yep, if you can see him, Julie. If I was gonna make sure. Yep, if you can see him. So you didn't notice? Nope, if I can see him, Julie. Of course. Do you realize that? Yep, I was gonna make sure. I know, right? If you can see him. Yes, of course. So, if you consume, yep. If I consume visually, and I was gonna make sure. No, right? Yep, if you consume visually. Of course. Until you realize that. Yep, if you consume visually. Right, did not realize that. I know, right? Yep, if you consume visually. I was gonna make sure. No, right? Yep, if you consume Julie. And I was gonna make sure. Until you realize that. Yep, if you consume Julie. And I was gonna make sure, right? Yep, if you consume Julie. Yeah, of course. Until I realize that. Yep, if I consume. Yep, Julie. Of course. Until I realize that. If I consume. Yep. I was gonna make sure. Until you realize that. Yep. Of course. I was gonna make sure, isn't? Yep. Julie. Right. Until I realize that. Yep. If you consume. Yep. Okay. I was gonna make sure. I know, right? Yep. Okay. Whoa. Okay, I'm not sure I realize that. I got it here. Yeah. I did not realize that. Yep. Until you figure this out. Okay. I was gonna make sure. I know, right? If you could see me, Julie. If I was gonna make sure. Right. Until I realize that. Okay. I know, right? It's not going anywhere. So, if I consume, yep, Julie. Of course. Yep, no, yeah. I know, Julie. Of course. If you consume. Okay, so you have no idea, right? Yep, if you consume, Julie. Of course. At least you was trying to. If I was gonna make sure. I know, right? At least. If I consume, Julie. And I realize that from now on. If I consume. Yep. If you just last time, Julie. Of course. I was gonna make sure. I know, right? Yep, it does, Julie. Of course. I'm not sure you realize that. For some reasons, visually. Right, you're not sure? Yep. If I can assume visually. Until you realize that. Definitely. Right, you're not sure? Yep. Of course. Until you realize that. I know, right? Yep, if you consume. Right. I did not realize that. I know, right? If you consume visually. Yep. If I consume. Right. Until you realize that. I know, right? Yep. If you consume. Yes. Until I realize that. And try to figure this out visually. And you're no sure, isn't? Nope. Visually. Of course, you're not sure you realize that. Well, if you consume Jolie. And I'm not sure, definitely. Right. You're not sure you realize that? Yep. Because I am not sure. Yep, it was visually. Until you didn't notice. Of course. Until you didn't notice. Yep. If you consume visually. Of course. Until you didn't notice. Yep, if you consume visually. Until I didn't notice. Yep, if you consume visually. Of course. Until I realized that, definitely. I know, visually. Right, yeah. Did I realize that? Yep, visually. Of course. I was gonna make sure. No, right? Yep, if you consume visually. Of course. Until you realize that. Yep, if you consume visually. Right, you know, sure isn't? Nope. Okay. Did I realize that? Yep, if you consume visually. Of course. Until you realize that. Yep. Because I am no sure isn't? Nope. Okay. Not sure you realize that? Yep. Okay, yeah, sure. Yep. Right. You're not sure, isn't? Nope. If you consume. Yep. Until I realize that. Right. You're not sure, isn't? Yep. Of course. Until you didn't notice. Right. Not sure you realize that. Yep, if you consume Julie. Of course. Not sure you realize that. Yep, if you consume Julie. Of course. Not sure you realize that. I know. Just went out of nowhere for Julie. Right, yeah. You know, sure. Yep. Because I am no sure for Julie. Of course. Until you realize that. Yep, if you consume Julie. Of course. Not sure you realize that. I know, right? Yep, if you consume Julie. Of course. Not sure you realize that. I know, right? Yep, if you consume. Right. I was gonna make sure. I know, right? Yep. Okay. Not sure you realize that. I know, Julie. Of course. Until you realize that. Yep. If I consume. Bye. You have no idea, right? Yep. If you consume. Okay. I was gonna make sure. I know.